Would you sell a kidney to feed your family? That's the dilemma many refugees face. Organ trafficking is now a booming business. After the Syrian conflict broke out in 2011, more than 1.5 million people escaped to Lebanon. They now make up a quarter of the population, and many live in abject poverty. With little money and poor accommodations, some have now resorted to selling organs to support themselves and their loved ones. An exclusive TRT World documentary has gained access to traffickers and victims. In a moment, I'll be speaking with the director, but first, here's a sneak peek of silent death on a Syrian journey.
عايشين بين الجرادين يعني الجردون فز على التخت حد ابني قد الجردون وزنه 2 كيلو ونص يعني صرت خايف كل الليل 24 ساعة واعي بس حتى ما يقرط له دينته أو ياكله أو شيء. فات لقيت بس كبيرة قاعدة عم تحوس راسه وعن جد عم بحكي. طب أنا وين بروح؟ ما في مطرح سكر البيت مزبوط. ما في إمكانية إني أنا أعمل لهم غرفة أو حتى أجيب له تخت سكر له. حط ربطة الخبز بتلاقي جردون ماكل لك نصها، يعني بدك تشتري ربطة الخبز إلك ولا الجردون. في أكثر من جوع، أكثر من جوع. مش الجوع وحده ما بيكفي. في جوع نفسي، في جوع فكري، في بكل شيء. يعني انعرض علي إني بيع كلوتي. فكرت فيها أنا، كانت مزحة بالبداية ولكن تطورت وصار الشغلة صح. وفقت قلت أنا بدي ربي أولادي، بدي بس إني أشتري بيت صغير. على أساس يعطوني $8000. أعطوني $1000 بالبداية، دخلوني مستشفى.
Joining me now in the studio is the director of the documentary, my colleague Mohsin and Naimi. Mohsin, great access and a really good film. I watched it closely. It's very moving, especially when you hear from the victims like Abu Ahmed, when he says, hunger drove me crazy. I wonder, from the people you met, is that generally the trend, that they were that desperate and they felt they had to do this?
Well, all the people that I've met, all the victims that I've met are really desperate. Abu Ahmed, who is really like a moving person, says that he feels like he falls in a well, but no one see him, and even if he screams for help, no one can even hear him. So he was in a situation that he couldn't even do anything, because he was really stuck in a desperate situation. Abdullah was the same. He ended up in Beirut with his mom and sister. He had nothing to survive. Begging, it doesn't work. There's almost 1 million official Syrian in Beirut, in Lebanon, 1.5 in total. So Abdullah, for example, never said it explicitly, but he kind of said, I had to do the sacrifice because the only other option would have been forcing my mom or my sister to go to prostitution. And for him, as a man of the family, he has to do something, and the only thing he has to sell is a part of his body.
Yeah, and what I love about this piece of work is that you speak to people on all sides of it. Those who are not giving up their organs, those who are making a buck out of it, facilitating it, right? One of those guys is Abbas. Let's take a look at a clip where you speak to Abbas, one of the organ traffickers in Lebanon.
أنا مساعد العالم. محمد منه مستقبله. وكذا شغله حاولت، أنا ما كان يزبطني شيء. أنا على الفكرة وهو جاي لحاله. بس أنا قدم على راسك لأن على راسي كتير. أنا بوصله مكان معين مش مكان ما حنو بيعملوا عملية. أكيد يا جماعة بيسووا بالمكان لو أنا بشتغل معه. أنا بوصله لنقطة معينة. في شخص يستلمه وبياخده وبيجي ما بعرف، بس محمد نزله ورجع بياخده. بس غير طبعا إنه ما نزلته، يعني أكيد بيروح إذا ما بيجيبش بلا كلوي. ما في شيء يندم عليه أصلا. أكيد ما بنصح حدا يعملها. إنه أنا عندي وضع، بس اللي ما عنده وضع ليه يفرغ شغلي من جسمه مثلا، بس أنا عندي وضع وعملت هيك. قبضت $3000 وبعدين يعطوني 5000 عشان نسافر فيهم.
I mean, on the trafficking side, among the traffickers, these are interesting, complicated characters, right? I mean, to some, they're just pure villains. Is it the norm that these guys are exploiting and cheating the people they're doing business with?
First of all, Abbas, meeting Abbas, the middleman, is really an experience, because the guy look friendly, look very nice. If you meet him randomly in a cafe, you will start a discussion with him. But on the other hand, this guy has blood on his hands. He carries always a gun. He's dealing with every possible thing, whether it is like, weapons, organs, whatever. And when you start like, asking him questions, you discover that this guy has no remorse. He has not even like, the beginning of a start of any regrets. He just like sell everything that can be sold. He said, I could have sold Syria. Business is business, whatever it is. So this guy is obviously the middleman who says that people are coming to see him to sell the organ, usually because they heard that someone did it and etc. That's his version. To be honest with you, I think that some people are also like going and fishing for desperate Syrian, the one who lives under the bridge, the one who lives just like on the streets. And when you see these people, you start like, a conversation with them, and you realize that if they stay longer in this position, they will be also attracted to this illegal trade. So Abbas, the middleman, he's the guy who's putting donors into a network, which then send them to the hospital.
Yeah, does he know about what's going to happen next, or does he not care about it?
No, I asked him the question. He has no idea. He said that there's two separate gangs. They operate like, differently. Even when he drops a donor, he put a donor in a car, and then the donor is dropped somewhere. Another car picks him up, and then it goes like until he reaches the hospital, and then after he comes back. And he has this very cynical sentence. He says, I don't really care actually what happened to them. All I know is that when they go with 2 kidneys, they come back with 1, and also he gets his money.
Yeah, and it's not so simple that you have 2 and then you have 1 and 1 can work and you'll be fine. There seems to be a long-term impact on many of these victims. Let's hear what one victim says about the impact organ trafficking has had on him.
حتى $1000 اللي أعطوني إياه حطيتها على حالي. يعني ما حطيتها على أولادي. وهلا أنا عم عاني أجيب أدوي وما أدوي لحالي. وعم بضعف. يعني حتى جسدياً عم بضعف. يعني حاس حالي رايح باتجاه المجهول. احنا راس مالنا نحن الفقراء. أنا بعت صحتي، أنا بعت راس مالي. يعني رجعت لورا كثير. رجعوا شقوا من هون مرتين. اشتغلوا ما بعرف اشتغلوا. ورجعت طلعوني ما بريش من هون لهون. طل مي ما فينا نشربها كيف ما كان. بدك تشتريها، ما بيكون معك حقها تتشربه. وإذا شربت أي مي بتعب. أحيانا أنا برجع بقعد مع حالي بقول يا عمي إنه حلم مرق علي. لو ما عم موجوع أو بنوجع أو بتضايق.
I mean, if there's an element of regret, deep regret, this can't be good for them, can it, Mohsen?
I asked the Abdullah, the young one, who, do you have any regret now? He said, obviously, I would never advise this to anyone unless they have a good reason, and I had one. So obviously, he did it for the money so he can save his family. For Abu Ahmed, who is like, much older, obviously he regrets. He regrets every day, and he had this really nice sentence which explains everything. He says, "Poor people have only their health, and I sold mine." And the problem that he's now facing health consequences. He cannot drink like before. He cannot walk like before. He cannot like lift heavy charges. He's in a position where he thinks he did something very, very bad. Of course, he cannot go backward. So he has a lot of regrets. And the biggest regret for him that he's not even take any gain. He wasn't even able to improve his family situation because all the money he got, he spent it all on medicine. And that's what he told me many times.
Right. Okay, Mohsen, it's a really wonderful film.
Thank you.
I watched early versions of it and the latest version of it. It's really compelling. It's very moving. And the good news is you can watch the full documentary here on TRT World. It premieres this Saturday at 9:15 GMT. It'll run all week. And of course, you can watch it on YouTube. It'll be posted on YouTube next week, so you can watch it whenever you like. Well, the illegal trafficking of organs isn't limited to Lebanon, of course. Let's take a look now at the global situation. Here's this report by the newsmakers, Sandra Gutmann.
Organ transplants have changed medicine forever.
The world's first heart transplant patient.
It was only in 1967 that the world witnessed the first human heart transplant. Just 10 years earlier, doctors reinserted the world's first kidney. The practice is growing fast across the world, but so has the demand for organs. Hundreds of thousands of people are stuck on waiting lists. There's simply not enough supply. And with that shortage, a black market of organ trafficking is thriving. It's estimated that every year, more than 10,000 organs are sold illegally worldwide. A business that generates between $840 million and $1.7 billion of profit a year. The price of an illegal organ can be as high as $100,000, but donors usually get less than 5%, about $5,000. In the poorest countries like Nepal and Pakistan, many vulnerable people are ripped off by traffickers.
I gave my kidney 13 years ago and my back still hurts. I was cheated by my broker, but I kept quiet.
Meanwhile, Egypt has become a major destination for patients looking for an illegal transplant.
Egypt has got some very good medical facilities, but they have got very low levels of enforcement of the law. It's illegal to sell organs in Egypt, but we find that there's a lot of Syrian refugees, also Somalian refugees, Eritrean, Sudanese, who are trying to get to Europe. They don't have the money. They are then meeting the traffickers. They sell the organ, and that pays for them and their family to get to Europe.
So what can be done to keep people safe and meet a global demand for life-saving organs?
All you have to do is say yes.
Most countries are still trying to fight taboos and encourage volunteers to donate. In China, the government has been supplying its organ bank from prisoners on death row. The program has come under international fire, though Beijing insists it's been shut down.
We already 100% eradicated the unethical source of the organ from executed prisoners.
In Iran, cash incentives have cut the waiting list dramatically. It's the only country in the world that allows the sale of kidneys, though critics fear it encourages poor people to sell their organs. In meeting the demand for healthy organs, relying on altruism has so far proven a slow solution. But until scientists can mass-produce human tissue, that may remain the only option. Sandra Gutmann, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is author and human rights advocate Ethan Gutmann. He's the co-founder of the International Coalition to End Organ Pillaging in China. In Brisbane, we have Campbell Fraser. He's an international organ trade expert at Griffith University. And in Vienna, Aimee Comrie. She's a criminal justice officer at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. I thank you all for joining us. Aimee Comrie, we began looking at Lebanon and the situation vulnerable Syrian refugees find themselves in, where they're selling their organs. I wonder globally, just how bad is the situation when it comes to both organ trafficking and organ harvesting?
Thank you. I cannot speak to the specific details of the situation in this documentary, but what I can say is that we know that this is a very serious form of human trafficking, and there is a shift in the data that we are collecting at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. We are seeing emerging forms of human trafficking, and human trafficking for organ removal is one of those forms which we are collecting more and more data on. It is very difficult to refer to a global figure. This is a very unreported crime, as are most forms of human trafficking, but probably more so in this case, because it's a highly technical and very stigmatizing crime. So what I can say is we have collected cases from all regions of the world. There is not a region or a country which is immune to this form of human trafficking.
Ethan Gutmann, given your expertise, tell me why you think China is particularly bad at this.
Well, there are really only two countries that you can go to if you want to get a political or religious prisoner harvested for your benefit. And one of them is China, the other is ISIS. Now, obviously, ISIS isn't big in this industry. They're very small, and we only know about that because some of their camps have been overrun and that kind of thing. But we've been working on this for quite some time with China, and what we know is that in 1995, in a place called Xinjiang, and maybe some of your audience knows it as East Turkestan. This is the northwest province of China, vast desert province, filled with Muslims, Uyghurs, about 15 to 17 million. That in the 90s, the mid-90s, they started to do live organ harvesting, state-sponsored. This was done on the execution fields of Xinjiang. And we know that after that, about 2 years later, when there was a little Muslim rebellion or Uyghur rebellion over some Ramadan issues, that they started to harvest political prisoners for their organs. And this happened, it was a very small group, about 6 people who were harvested, we think, maybe 12, but it was harvested on behalf of 6 high-ranking Chinese Communist Party cadres. After that, we have an explosion in transplant activity when Falun Gong came online.
Yeah, Falun Gong members.
What I'd really like to talk about today, because in some ways we think those Falun Gong numbers may be receding.
Okay.
But there's a very disturbing new development, which is that in the last year, apparently 98% of all the Uyghurs in Xinjiang have been tested, given blood test and a DNA test. Now, I know that figure is spectacular, but it's not my figure.
Okay.
This comes from Radio Free Asia and Human Rights Watch.
Okay. Okay, so let me ask Campbell Fraser about this. And of course, Falun Gong members, China considers them a terror organization.
Yeah, I'd just like to
they see themselves just as a religious group. I mean, these are spectacular claims against China. If the Chinese are doing this, it's state-sponsored, why isn't anyone doing anything about it?
Well, the reason that nobody's doing anything about it is because we completely reject the claims that are being made in respect to the supporters of the Falun Gong. I'm a member of a group of people who have spent most of the last year in China with representatives of the World Health Organization and representatives of the Vatican, and also the current president of the Transplantation Society, and 4 of the immediate past presidents of the Transplantation Society. We have spent an extended period of time in a number of transplant hospitals in the last year, in the last 18 months. We have also interviewed 132 patients who purchased organs in China over the last 10 years. And what we find is quite different from the claims that are being made by the Falun Gong and their representatives. And what we find is that the evidence that is being used for the Falun Gong claims tends to be coming from people who have got a vested interest in undermining the Chinese state.
Okay, and before we move on from China, fair point. I mean, and you've made your point emphatically.
Sure.
So before we move on from China, because I want to kind of go globally again, Ethan Gutmann, you want to respond to that?
Well, I almost don't know what to say. I mean, I'm not a Falun Gong supporter. I'm a supporter of the human race. The fact is, I don't make any money off this. I've been living off my wife for the last 10 years. If China's finally reforming, nobody would welcome that more than me because I have other things to do. Unfortunately, this is a fairly serious issue, and we're not even talking about Falun Gong so much right now.
Gutmann.
As the Uyghurs. Yes.
Well,
Sure.
Mr. Gutmann, in your book, it's all Falun Gong. I see so much of Falun Gong.
No, that's not true. That's not true. Well, good. Well, that's great. But the first, if you read it, then the first chapter you know is on the Uyghurs. I mean, that's a fact. And so much.
Yeah, exactly.
And I was the first person to bring in the Tibetans into the issue. Come on. Yeah.
In your book, you clearly state that one of the weaknesses in your work is that you haven't been able to speak to people who have purchased organs, the foreigners who went to China. In fact, you make that as a recommendation in your book that is something worth exploring. And that is exactly what we have done.
Give Ethan a chance to respond to this, and then I'm going to put a lid on China.
Wait, hang on.
Ethan, response? Yeah.
That is not a, wait a minute, that's, hold on, hang on. That's not a weakness. No, that's not a weakness. Kilgore and Matus did several studies. Kilgore and Matus are colleagues of mine at End Organ Pillaging.
It is a weakness.
And wait a second, hang on. They actually did quite a bit of work with the people who received organs and organ tourists and so forth.
Okay.
They didn't get much out of it. I mean, the
Campbell
organ
Fraser
tourists in
rejects the
China
methodology.
tend to be kept at, they tend to be kept at arm's length from the process.
Okay. So
I don't consider that a weekness. I consider that it wasn't my priority. My priority was to talk to doctors and nurses.
Hold on, both of you,
and
Ethan and Campbell.
refugees.
Ethan and Campbell, if you could hold on both for a minute. So let me bring Aimee back in here. Aimee, is it? Yeah. Do you believe that state-sponsored organ harvesting is happening, whether by China or anyone else?
I'm not in a position to comment on that particular example. What I can say is that are we talking about organ harvesting, or are we talking about organ trafficking, or are we talking about human trafficking for organ removal?
Allow me to break this up.
Yes. Okay. So please, what I can tell you about the difference between human trafficking for organ removal is that we're talking about a person, a real victim. When we're talking about organ trafficking or organ harvesting, we're talking about the trafficking of a particular organ. So it's very important. If there are the elements of human trafficking in a situation, then we're talking about a victim. And that victim has rights, has access to assistance and protection, and should not be prosecuted also. Because are we talking about a donor? Are we talking about a seller? Are we talking about possibly a criminal? Or are we talking about a victim?
So let me separate this out.
Okay,
hold on.
We're not talking about a seller here.
Campbell, give me a second, please. Aimee, let me separate this out now, right? Let's put aside the claims of state-sponsored organ harvesting. Clearly, Aimee, there's a supply and demand issue here, like drugs, right? There's a supply and demand issue here. So you might have wealthier people who find regulations too tight to do this legally, and you might find desperate people who need money, who get involved in this sort of thing. So tell me, why is there the supply and demand issue globally, and how can you actually solve the root causes, Aimee?
Thank you. I mean, that's the crux of the matter. We're talking about vulnerability to exploitation. And the people, as was commented earlier, are poor, uneducated, and they do not understand the long-term consequences of living without an organ. While it's true that, in a situation where one has access to very good healthcare, one can live a life with one kidney, perfectly fine. But the individuals that we are discovering in our cases, in our work, are poor, destitute people whose vulnerability is being exploited. And they may consent to so-called, donate their organ, and they may even receive some small sum of money. However, there's clearly deception and fraud in many of these cases. So they do not understand the lifelong consequences. They often do not receive the sums of money that were promised. And they face terrible consequences for their health, for the health of their family, their social stigma associated with it. These are often people who worked in manual labor who are not able to work in those positions anymore, which has an effect on their entire families. Often we see victims who have substance abuse problems. And this is very serious, and the stigma around it prevents them from seeking help. And for that reason, we think the role of civil society and NGOs is very critical, because they are the ones who often are coming into contact with these victims in the first place.
Ethan Gutmann,
so in terms of,
certainly, please finish your point, Aimee. I thought you finished your point. Yes.
Yeah, you know, what can we do better? We're just at the beginning of this problem. It's just starting to unravel. So I think what we need is better data. We need resources to invest in data to collect it, reliable evidence to further investigate this problem. We need stronger legal provisions. Many countries don't acknowledge human trafficking for organ removal as a form of human trafficking. And ultimately, we need better cooperation. Police are not used to working with medical professionals. They are not used to going into a surgery, and they don't know what types of evidence to collect. And so we are actually at UNODC, we're developing a video crime scene tool that could be used in a medical clinic, for example, and trying to bring those groups of people together so they can better identify, protect victims, and investigate and prosecute this terrible crime.
Okay, so Ethan Gutmann, would you agree that there's a globally exploitative system where generally it's organs from poorer people going to richer people, poorer countries going to richer countries?
I wouldn't deny that, and I think the work that other people are doing on those particular issues, on the exploitation issue, is very important. As you know, my stuff is about, so I can't just disregard the state-sponsored organ harvesting issue. The fact is, the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives, has put out a resolution on this. It passed unanimously. So did the European Parliament. So we can't just push that aside. I think the important thing, though, is your guest is right. We need information, and China's not giving that in this case. They're not being, they say there's a lot of voluntary donors, but there have been a series of phone calls made over the past year to many, many hospitals in China. This is just quite recently came out. And what we've discovered is that the two things have happened. One is the hospital administrators never talk about sourcing anymore, but they go further. They actually say, we can't talk about where these organs come from, and they make it very clear. They say it's orders from the top. The second point is that we see no change in transplant volume. So since we see no change in transplant volume, we are left to at least worry, without verification, that this is still organs are being used from Tibetans and Uyghurs and Falun Gong and maybe even House Christians.
Okay, and so, perhaps they're being very obtuse in terms of the information. Let me bring in Campbell Fraser. Campbell Fraser, we are running out of time. I've got to wrap very soon, so very briefly,
all right, now,
please.
Do you want me to talk about China, or do you want me to talk about other countries?
Let's talk about a global exploitative system. If you, tell me if you agree there's a globally exploitative system.
Actually, no. Definitely, there's a huge problem. I have met kidney sellers in Pakistan. I've met kidney sellers in the Philippines, and I've met kidney sellers, Lebanese and Syrians who have sold kidneys in Egypt. I've done a lot of interviewing with them, and their stories are absolutely horrific. They, as our other speaker said, they do not understand what they're doing by selling an organ. It is sold to them as being a very minor procedure. It's easy, it's safe, there's no risk. So there's certainly not informed consent. In these countries, they are selling their kidney for approximately $2,500. Currently, for a foreigner to go to Egypt to buy a kidney, it will be about $115,000 US. So that is showing the profit that is making. And I'm working now with the US Department of State looking at how this may be also funding terrorism. So we're seeing the link now between Syrians who are coming out of refugee camps and looking at where the buyers of the organs, because remember, I spend most of my time talking to the buyers of the organs. And what we're finding is, rather than just paying a lump sum of $115,000 to one country, they are actually laundering the money for the brokers. So there'll be some money going to the US, some money going to France, some going to the UK, going all over the place. So what they're actually doing now is that the buyers of the organs are becoming implicated in the moving of money around. Right. And then what happens, after somebody has bought an organ, they become a broker. They go home, and then they are offered a 10% commission for any other patients they can send to Pakistan, to Egypt, to the Philippines.
And that's a really important point that you make. And in many ways, it seems to follow the same kind of chronology that drug money does, which is fascinating. Listen, we covered a lot of ground here, and I thank you all for your patience. Ethan Gutmann, Campbell Fraser, and Aimee Comrie. I've got to wrap and move on. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still ahead, Zimbabwe's president sacks his deputy. Does this guarantee Grace Mugabe's succession to the throne? And should you get paid if you don't work? We debate the merits of a universal basic income.